Jerry Fabyanic on KYGT LPFM 102.7 and 103.9 here in Idaho Springs. And this is The Rabbit Hole, and we're in our second hour of Writer's Talk. And on the phone with me is Annalisa Parent. And Annalisa is going to tell you more about herself because I left all my text up there. I know Annalisa, but there's all this great stuff and everything because, you know, you're this fabulous author who's written this really creative book called Storytelling for Pantsers, and we're going to get into that. But before we do, tell us more about you.
Sure. So I am a writing coach. I help writers start, finish, and bring to publication writing in all genres. I'm specializing right now in fiction and nonfiction, and I'm also the senior editor over at Laurel Elite Books, and we publish mostly nonfiction books, but we do consider high-quality fiction and picture books.
All right. And you teach also?
Yes, so I am an English professor at the Norwich University undergraduate program and also in their graduate school.
Where's Norwich?
Norwich University is in Vermont.
All right.
It's in Northfield, Vermont.
All right. Okay. So you're a professor and writer's coach and now published author. So you have a few under your belt here, experiences, huh?
Indeed. Yes, this is my first nonfiction book, and I'm really excited about this.
Mm-hmm. And you've gotten into the story here, or the work here, Storytelling for Pantsers. And it was really interesting. My last guest, John Bassoff, during our discussion brought up, you know, because I like to ask my writers, you know, like, what is your methodology? What gets you into it? What got you going and everything, too? And he's a brilliant writer. He's creative. He's, you know, like, oh, my gosh. I mean, the imagery that is within his work, I mean, you can taste it, you can feel it, you can hear it, everything there. He says he's an outliner, you know, initially. And so we had a discussion on that, and I said, oh, I'm glad you brought that up because my next guest is going to talk about this very thing here. So let's talk about what is this pantser thing versus planner, outliner, etc.
Sure. So pantsers are fiction writers who don't write from an outline. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be times when they do outline or they make a rough sketch, but for the most part, they're flying by the seat of their pants, and that's the way that works best for them to be creative.
Uh-huh. So just get into it and start telling a story, start creating characters.
Yeah, indeed. And so what happens for these pantsers is they get really lost, right? So they end up down this rabbit hole of, you know, where's my character going? Oh, my goodness, I've got 100 pages written, but there's really no story here yet. It's just fleshing out a character, so what do I do now? And so what my book, Storytelling for Pantsers, does is gives a system for a writing process that really has no system. And many, many pantsers end up giving up because they don't understand what to do with the material that they've generated, because it's just this hodgepodge of a little bit of plot and a little bit of character, and maybe we've revised this chapter over here, but we're not sure where it goes. And that gets very confusing. And so as a pantser myself, I have shared a system that I've used for myself and that I've used for the writers that I work with to kind of make some sense out of what I call the muckety-muck mess.
Interesting. And wonder, if you were listening last time, because I brought that up. You know, my next novel, you know, I just started writing, and then I got all these chapters. I got 7, 8 chapters pretty much done. And then when I step back and look at them, I go like, you know, they kind of relate, but there's not a thread, it seems, running through them. So I'm sort of like, whoa, take a time out here. Because they're all, to me, vital parts of the story. Now my challenge is to weave it together, I guess, you know, into a more coherent type of expressions for the, you know, for the reader to follow through and say, what are you doing here? So, yeah, I mean, that's you find that it's fairly common among pantsers.
Absolutely. You know, and that's what defines a pantser. And the thing is, you know, that I write about in my book is, you know, outliners don't have it any better. You know, they're writing from an outline, but at the end of the day, in their revision process, they're still having to ask the same questions It's just that the time that they might ask that question might come later or sooner. We're all asking the same questions once we're finalizing a story. It's just that, as you've discovered, Jerry, once you've written 7 or 8 chapters, you scratch your head and say, what next? And so this book is intended to help people with that what next when they get into that situation of, oh gosh, what do I do now? And, it's worked really well. This is a system that I've been using with writers for several years now. And it's helped them to go from, I'm going to throw my manuscript away, to, oh my gosh, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So, and that feels really good because, I muddled through being a pantser for 7 years. It took me to write my first novel because I started again or picked it up in the middle. Because, there weren't any books out there to say, what do you do if you're a writer who doesn't write in that sort of traditional beginning, middle, end sense? So I'm hoping that this book is going to be something that will help people who felt like me when I wrote my first novel, and I hope that they can get theirs done in sooner than 7 years.
Well, I don't feel so bad because it only took me 5 on my first one. So so I'm thrilled that it only took me 5 years to get through it, and it was very much that way because my book, Sisyphus Wins, is I was the way it's structured. There's the main character, the protagonist, tells his life story, and so I had it. From the beginning, I said, okay, every 2 years. And I started, he's 7 years old, 9 years old. But I didn't write it that way. I mean, he was 7, he was 35, he was, 17, and I was jumping all over. And it was just, I think what was happening, and John brought this up in our last conversation, that stream of consciousness, I would picture him at a certain age and in this certain era. And so I had to write it. But then I had to go back and resort it all. Because the reader would no way be able to follow. What are you doing here? Jumping all over age-wise and everything. So it would be cases like that then.
Exactly. Yeah, it sounds like you are a pantser through and through when it comes to your fiction.
and how, when I brought this up with John, about the concept of imagination, that, and it would seem to be, and this may not be fair, because his work is brilliant, and very imaginative. But I've had this, thing that if you outline everything ahead of time, you feel like you're in a box and it stifles the creativity. That's not necessarily the case, though.
No, it's not. And for outliners, for them, that really helps them and inspires their creativity. And we can understand that when we think about the limitations that we put on ourselves that make us more creative. What do I mean? Well, when you try a writing prompt, right, and you're like, okay, describe an alien planet, and you can only use 3-syllable words, right? Like, that's very limiting, but somehow we're suddenly very creative, right? And so if we understand that, then we can understand where outliners need that structure to prompt their creativity. Whereas we pantsers are like, whoa, don't get into my space. Like, I need my creative space over here. And that's how we express our creativity. For an outliner, that's terrifying. That wouldn't work for them at all, any more than for us it would work to sit down and say, okay, so today I'm going to write where he walks to the store. Like, that, it just wouldn't work for us, And so, one of the things that I talk about in the book is, you're an pantser or an outliner, you're really not going to be both of those. However, that said, the caveat is, for me, when I write fiction, I'm an absolute pantser. But when I write nonfiction, I'm an outliner. So, it can change by genre what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, because I think when we first talked and we were talking about your work, storytelling for pantsers, and I said, okay, were you a pantser when you wrote this? And you said no, because it's not, you're not. So, you laid that out then pretty clearly.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because I've been writing for so long that when I write out an outline, it tends to be fairly general because I know what I'm going to fill in specifically. And there were some pantsing moments in this book where I got a good idea and I kind of filled it in, and then I had to figure out, okay, where does this go in the context of the outline? And what you'll see, Jerry, I'll send you a copy of the book. What you'll see in the end is that I shared some of my writing process. And, I'm an old school paper and pencil kind of a gal, which means that when I get stuck, I print out the part where I'm stuck, and I literally cut it apart with scissors and move the pieces around on the table. And that's how I visualize that for myself. So, that's kind of like pantsing meets outlining, because I'm certainly outlining, but I'm doing it in this very non-traditional way. I would not have gotten a gold star in 4th grade for that kind of outlining.
Yeah, and, and two thoughts that come into mind. One is that, one of the thoughts I had is to literally print out in hard copy each of the chapters and lay them out just like you said, because when you're looking at it on a computer, you're only looking at one screen at one time. Whereas when you have it in hard copy, you can literally start moving them around and placing them.
That's true, absolutely. And, each chapter in the book has a free download, and one of the free downloads is exactly that activity. So when I finish a first draft of a novel, I go through and I write down on these plot cards, and that's one of the free downloads that comes with the book. So I live on Lake Champlain, and sometimes when it's a high-pressure system like it is today, it hops across the lake to get cell signal. That's a disaster.
Okay, well, but that's one of the that's probably about the only downside of living on Lake Champlain. How great is that?
Yeah, it's beautiful, but there in certain times when it tries to get cell signal across the lake, you say, "Oh boy, I've only got one bar. Must be getting a tower in New York."
Oh, that's funny. Oh, that's great stuff. Yeah, but anyway, so you were talking about the cards. You said you could download some cards. So why don't you go back over that concept? We'll put back up there.
Yeah. So every chapter has a free downloadable, and in one of the chapters where I talk about how to organize your plot, there are these plot cards that I use to identify the major moments in the plot, and it might be a full chapter, but usually it's scenes within a chapter. And what that does is I like to spread them out on my bedroom floor, and so I've got my whole novel spread out all over my bedroom floor, and I can see the whole thing, which is a wonderful visual and kinesthetic experience to start to pull what's not necessary, to start to rearrange, and to really make sure that the bridges that I've created between my major plot points really work to serve the overall story arc.
Okay. All right. So to use it, yeah, it seems that because, as you say, kinesthetically, because our brains, we think conceptually, we can visualize. And I do this when I do the New York Times crossword puzzle. I did yesterday's and today's, which are like the toughest ones. And I got about 3/4 of the way through both. I was very proud of myself. Yay! And I'll look at a clue, and I'll think of a word that can go across. And I go, okay, so 2 down will intersect that, and the third letter is going to be R. Okay, so what could this be? What I invariably find is if I really try just to imagine, it doesn't work. But as soon as I'm going to take a chance, and I'm going to put this word down in ink, and as soon as I do it, there's something visual that stimulates in the brain, and I go, aha, and here's the down word from that. I could think it, but it wasn't transferring over into this other concept, this other word. But as soon as I put the literal word on paper, it stimulated something in the brain, and immediately I get the word. There's something in the brain.
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you say that, Jerry, because so much of the work that I do is based on my long teaching background, where I studied neuroscience and I studied kinesthetic learning and visual learning and all of the modalities that really help people to learn best. And I take that into my writing coaching. So, you're saying this, and I'm thinking, well, gosh, Jerry, you're a visual learner. I bet you really depend a lot on, your visual feedback that you get, and that kinesthetic is really helping you to reinforce that. And so, I've told you about this one activity in the book. There are several in the book, and I try to address multiple learning styles so that people can really get the most of it. We're not all visual learners. We're not all kinesthetic learners. There are auditory learners, right? And so we all need to learn in the way that's best for us. And one of the things that I do as a writing coach is to really tap into that and help people to function and flow with their writing process in the way that their brain works best. So then we're optimizing writing and we're optimizing brain functioning, and that's really powerful.
Oh, wow. That's intriguing, Annalisa. You say that, because it takes me back into my days in the classroom when, as a younger teacher, way back in the day then, when God was a child and dirt was new, that I would tell my children, and she wasn't half the problem that you are, like this and laugh about it. But to learn that not all people learn the same way. Mm-hmm. And you talked about that visual versus kinesthetic versus, not versus, it's a different mode, and that's what right-brain people have a very difficult time on multiple choice or true-false questions sometimes because it's clear-cut and their brains don't function that way. But if you say, all right, you read To Kill a Mockingbird, expound for me in some way, and they'll think of some scene that's in there. Mm-hmm. And then visualize that scene and what comes up for them emotionally. Well, okay, I might not have, who was the neighbor of, Jim who did, mow down the flowers or something like that, Mrs. DuBose, for example. But they will remember the scene of the flowers, and they'll talk about the metaphor of that whole thing, because but I know they read the work, and they have internalized it very differently than perhaps the left brain kid who's got it all down and, aced the test.
Yeah, and you're spot on there, and that's one of the things that I call it my braggy brag moment in the book. My work in exactly what you're talking about, which is finding out how people think and really optimizing that to increase aha moments. Led to 2 Teacher of the Year nominations for me, which is a wonderful honor. And I love it that I can bring that into my work with the writers and really work in a way that speaks to them, because they're making the same kind of progress that my students made back in the day, but they're actually finishing novels and working them towards publication. And that is super, super exciting. I love watching that happen every day. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that creativity just pouring forth, and creativity comes in infinite amount of ways.
Absolutely, yeah. And when you can work with modalities of brain functioning, you have multiple points of entry into that, right? So you work on an exercise and it doesn't really speak to someone. Well, then you move to a different type of exercise, and you just keep trying to enter that space with that person, and eventually you're going to find a way for that writer to optimize creativity and fall into a really good space. And that's really what my work is about. It's finding what works for people, optimizing that, and help them to reach their goals. Mm-hmm.
And so let's say you put on a workshop and you have all these what we'll call aspiring writers come in, might be 12 of them, okay? How would you approach that workshop for them to start tapping into their inner writer? We'll put it that way.
Sure. Well, the most important thing is that every writer needs to find the writer that he or she is. And so I was not the kind of teacher, I was not the kind of professor, and I'm not the kind of writing coach who's going to stand at the front of the room and say, blah, 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 like Charlie Brown teacher. What we need to do is we need to dig into the hands-on, and then we need feedback. And so the brain learns best when it's in a cycle of attempt and feedback, and attempt and feedback, and attempt and feedback. And that doesn't happen when you've got a sage on the stage situation. And so none of the work that I do, whether it's one-on-one or if it's in a group setting, is that sort of me as the expert talking. Am I sharing information? Sure. But it's much more important that the participants are trying something and getting feedback and trying something and getting feedback. So all the ways that I set up workshops and retreats that I do with writers is around that feedback loop, because that's the most important thing for growth.
Mm-hmm. And then when they're sitting around the table, 12 people come in, they don't know each other. And they start to dialogue, they start to interact. What's been your experience when, and I'm sure you've seen, and even in your classroom, so we don't have to do a workshop because your classroom is basically a workshop in that regard, and you have these, adults, you're a college professor, sitting around. Think of what was that like? What do you see happening then with your students or the participants in the activity as you start moving forward, as they start moving forward into their processes?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to depend a lot on how long we're together. If this is a one-off workshop, then we're not going to spend as much time building community. But we always want to make sure that there's a safe space for people to feel comfortable. And that's a really important thing. If you're making yourself vulnerable to receive feedback, then it needs to be a safe place. And how do we create a safe place? Well, we have very strict parameters around the kind of feedback that's given. And one of the things that's maybe slightly controversial about the work that I do is that I strongly discourage peer-to-peer feedback, whether that's in a writing group setting or if it's like beta readers. I strongly discourage that, mostly because people end up getting the kind of feedback that confuses more than helps, mostly because a lot of people don't know how to give the right kind of feedback. And that's one of the things, you know, when I work with a group of writers, I train them in certain types of feedback to give that are very craft-based, and we talk about exactly what that looks like. And we also talk about how if you're going to go out on your own and get peer-to-peer feedback, then you're going to get reader feedback. And reader feedback sounds a lot like a third-grade book report. I liked it. I didn't like it. I like your character. I don't like your character. But once you start letting your neighbor's best friend's dog muck around in, you know, character types or archetypes or, you know, plot progression, that's not something that your lay person can talk about. So if you wouldn't hire your neighbor's best friend's dog to do the plumbing for you, then don't ask that person to give you feedback. You know, you want an expert if you care about your writing.
Interesting. And I can see, and I make a point that in other arenas, for example, in athletics, just because someone is really good at throwing a baseball or a football does not make that individual really good at teaching another how to throw the ball properly.
Absolutely, and I make that point in my book too. I mean, even if they have a certain area of expertise, knowing something and knowing how to teach something are two entirely different modalities.
Yeah.
And many well-intentioned people have given writers feedback that have led to them quitting. And that's a tragedy. That's awful. That's terrible because it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. And I'm thinking then in the process, if you're writing, one of the good things is, a couple of them. One is to be thinking about who your audience is. But then also perhaps, from almost the very beginning, is to start working with a professional editor, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of powerful feedback can really make a difference for growth in writers, and you can think about that. You mentioned the sports analogy. Maybe people grew up and they played an instrument or whatever it was, but when you get quality feedback that's timely and that encourages growth rather than scolding what is wrong, there's powerful work that happens there. And I hope that everyone has had that experience in some arena in their life and that they can understand the power of quality feedback.
Yeah, and my previous guest here was talking about, I'm thinking Sound of the Fury, Faulkner, and he had brought up about, the different elements when you have these things happening to you, and observation, experience, and so forth. And he pointed out that, because he's also a high school teacher, and we would talk to his students who might struggle with the writing, but have had some very powerful experiences. Maybe their family has gone through a traumatic situation, they were abandoned, whatever it is. And sometimes that's stuff we don't really want to write about, but since we experience it, we feel it. And therefore can get into it. And so to focus on it and say, okay, just put it here and get into that there, that experience there, and just telling that story, it starts to resonate. Again, you go back when you're talking about the brain and how it works, because that memory, that experience, that emotion is seared in the brain, into the human experience. And now to put it into written form, and just tell that story. There's so many dynamics come into play here with a writer.
Absolutely, and I think one of the really powerful things a starting place in that, because I think one of the things I talk about in the book, Storytelling for Pantsers, is about making your characters relatable. And we all have situations that we've had in our lives that are relatable. And one of the places where you can start is tell me about a moment where something went wrong, right? Because that keeps you from too much backstory, but it also jumps you right into, oh my goodness, what happened, right? It jumps us right into the problem. And it's often the problems, one, that create conflict, that creates fiction, but two, create that relatability of, okay, I haven't been through that exact experience, but I understand sadness, or I understand trauma, or I understand being frightened. Yeah. So that's a really powerful moment to start thinking about your story.
That's hilarious you bring that up. And by the way, everyone, this is Jerry Fabyanic on KYGT LPFM 102.7, 103.9. This is The Rabbit Hole, and Writers Talk here. Having a great conversation here with Annalisa Parent. And, and you brought up about this powerful traumatic, when it happened. Let's go back to the beginning of the show here. And I'm going like, okay, this isn't working. No, we got to make this work here. And so what was going through my head is, okay, this isn't working, but keep your cool. Yes, we have maybe dead air out there, and there's some other things there, but you'll see this through. But what was going through my mind was just keep your cool. You'll figure it out. We'll figure it out together. And, John was able to jump in here and help me through, and, so get there. But now I could tell that experience, tell that story. But you understood it because you've been in a situation just like that in a different context. Exactly.
And those are the moments. That's how we give our story emotional power. And that's why you can read a story written by someone who's just up on their craft about a person who's not the same gender as you, who's not the same age as you, who's living something that you've never lived, and you say, wow, that was powerful. Because of that relatability. Somehow they're able to capture the human experience and make that universal, even if you've never lived in that part of the world or experienced that experience.
Right. Yeah. And when you with a writer, okay, because when you're done with the manuscript, the next step, and hopefully you've already been working with an editor along the way, but either way, whether you have or is to move it to the editing process there. And I'm thinking of the difference between an outliner and a pantser. And the way I connected with my editor, Melanie, I was, we were at the Colorado Independent Publishers Association, CIPA, and she got up there and spoke about, her craft and everything. And there was something about her that just resonated. It was a feeling. So I did a little homework, I looked at her website and sent her an email. We started talking on the phone, and we've had this tremendous, awesome relationship ever since. And I think about that in terms of like with my writing, because I'm a pantser, and it was a feeling that I was having, as opposed to like, okay, let me see all your other work, and being much more objective, in something like that. And I'm wondering if you would have some feedback or insight on the process of editing, choosing an editor, connecting with one, given the style of writer that you are.
Sure. I mean, I think that you've hit something that's really important, which is kind of your gut feeling or your intuition around this person. You're going to be working with this person for an extended period of time, and you want to choose someone with whom you feel quite comfortable. Not only are you going to be vulnerable in sharing your writing, but writing is an intimate process, and so it's highly likely that there are going to be emotional moments along the way, whether it's frustration or, something that the person says brings something up in your personal life. So having that just safety, whatever that means for you, is really important. And secondly, a lot of people come to me and they say, how can I find a cheap editor? And I say, don't. So, you want to get the very best that you can afford. And one of the analogies I have is, if you're going to drive across the country and you ask me where can I find a cheap car, I'm going to say, don't.
Yeah.
You want the very best that you can afford. You want something that's going to take you on the long haul. You want someone who's going to be there for you. You want someone who has the expertise, and you're paying for that expertise. They need to know a lot of things in order to be a quality editor for you. Not only, it's not about the copy editing and the grammar and the syntax and where the periods go. Those are all important eventually. But what you want is not only someone who can understand story structure in multiple ways, but can explain to you the synthesis of the story structure and how that works. And in addition to that, not only talk to you about the elements of story, but to be able to say, here are some things you could try. So they would go beyond saying, the dialogue in Chapter 3 doesn't really work. Well, that's not helpful feedback, right? What doesn't work about it? It's not realistic. It doesn't sound like something a man would say. I mean, what's going on there? And so this person really needs to be able to say, it's not working, here's why, and here are some things that you could do to work around this so that you could start to think about what needs to be fixed. Notice that I didn't say, John needs to say, I'm a really nice guy, right? Because that doesn't help you to learn and grow as a writer. And really, a writing coach or a quality editor should have your best interest in mind, too. The manuscript's interest, your best interest as a growing writer, and your writing future.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating and excellent. Because again, back on my experience, but to have your editor be so in tune with your story that they get it. They're really in there, not just mentally, objectively, but heart and soul that feels that story that can help you along. And I'm going to draw on a sports metaphor here. And, in baseball, for example, you have the manager running the team, but you also have your coach, bench coach, sitting there. And so when the manager, because there's a bajillion things happening, oh my God, at every moment, every pitch, everything changes. And so, but the bench coach doesn't have to be the one making all the fine-tuning, but he could see the bigger picture. And then give feedback too, and I think that's what your editor does in large part also. And I had that experience with Melanie, where, and I would have a line or a few words by a certain character, and she'll say, "Do you really think this character would have said that?" Or in that tone. And when I step back, I went, "Oh, you're right."
Yeah.
Because when I wrote it the first time, my head was somewhere, but when I stood back from it, took the bigger view, then I realized that sometimes these things aren't working and they're not contributing to the story. In fact, they detract from the story if you do that.
Absolutely, and I think being in tune with that person, whether it's an editor that you're hiring or a writing coach to help you along the way, that you're so spot on with that. It's really, really important.
Yeah, no, it's a great and powerful. So, what do you do? When you mentioned earlier, Annalisa, about people get frustrated. Okay,
Yes.
and so I'm a potential client. I didn't have a good experience before, and we just happened to meet each other. Maybe a friend of mine had a gathering, and you showed up with your work, and and you're talking about and everything, and then I come up after in the Q&A or something and say, okay, I tried and this was not a good experience for me. I got frustrated, what do you do then as a professional to hear what this is and to help bring that aspiring writer who's had a fairly negative experience and has just said, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore, maybe to get him or her back on track again?
Sure. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that is, I would say, about 50% of the writers who come to me are in exactly that position. And, unfortunately, there are three things going on for them. Not only are they frustrated, but they feel like they want to give up, and they don't really trust anyone to give them feedback. And, one of the things that I write about in the book is that, neuroscientifically, there are different phases of feedback that correspond to the functioning of the brain and how it advances an idea. And most of the time, what has happened for this person is that he or she has gotten feedback at the wrong time and from the wrong person. And so one of the things that I'm able to do is talk them through what went wrong. Because oftentimes, I think we can all relate to this. Something goes wrong, we know it was wrong, but we don't really know why. And so I can start to talk them through, okay, I bet that you were experiencing a little bit of this. And I kind of walk them through just because I understand the feedback process so well. And that starts to help them to feel comfortable because I understand what the feedback process should have looked like. And so I really start there with those people. And then once we kind of get to a spot where they're able to talk about, okay, these are the things that went wrong, this is what didn't work for me in this scenario, then I can also start to identify, here's what it could have looked like, or here's what I want out of a feedback scenario. Because oftentimes people don't really know. They just think they want some feedback, but they don't really know what that means.
Right.
So once I've helped them to identify what it is that they're looking for in feedback on their manuscript, then we can start to work together and move toward that goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. You're fascinating when you say that, because what came to mind too is that maybe help him or her eventually come to understand that maybe he or she was given a gift. That this person giving the feedback, who was a potential editor, we'll say, and didn't work out, and and really shot me down, whatever, probably would not have been a good editor from the very beginning. And so it was good that did happen. And so that you could find, or come across or intersect with another person who would understand your story and feel it and move you there and move that, frustrated aspiring writer to not be frustrated and to gain hope and willing to trust again. I like the way you put that with the trust factor.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I think that's one thing that is overlooked, and it's easy. When you're a beginner, you sort of think that any expert is the right expert, but that's not necessarily true. And one of the things that I emphasize really strongly in my book is this person working in a way that incorporates the way your brain functions? Because that's really, really important. And it's actually dangerous if you work with someone who doesn't understand that, because you can literally reprogram the neural pathways of your brain to start to only look for the negatives. And that once a writer gets to that point, it becomes really hard to continue to be creative.
That's an excellent point there, because there's still that mammalian within us, and that's fear. And, if, any animal has a bad experience on something, touch something, or, even when we were children, and you learn the word hot very quickly. We don't like pain. We're averse to pain, and that's psychological pain. And so when we feel we've been beat up, we don't want to go back to that scene again.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, and I mean, you're right. You're completely spot on with the neuroscience behind it in the interaction between the neurocortex, the neocortex, and the limbic system. That's exactly what you're talking about. So, working with someone who understands what that means and can really address the time for critical feedback and the time for creative feedback, those are really important aspects of the person that you're going to work with in creating your magnum opus.
Wow. Yeah, this is fantastic stuff. I'm amazed at our conversation here and how it's gotten into, because when we first started talking, coming on, I never really thought about neuroscience or anything like that. And yet, here it is. It's a critical element of it. Not that a writer has to be worried about it. Oh, well, what's my psychological, profile?
No, that's what they should depend on their writing coach for, is to take care of them in that way. You're exactly right. They don't need to worry about it. They just need to work with someone who understands how it works.
Mm-hmm. And to get that, and that's what, we're both teachers. You're at the college level. I was at the middle and high school level. But to understand where those, your clientele is, called your students, out there, and how each one of them is different than the other. There's not two of them. They're like snowflakes. There's not two alike.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Yeah, and that's why I talk about writers needing a system and not a class.
Wow.
So.
Good. Okay, and then so let's go back to your work itself, and talk about one more time, and then if people want to be able to order it, learn more, give us some information about how that could happen, Annalisa.
Absolutely. So if they would like to work with me, we do have openings in my Writing Gym VIP membership. It gives your writing a workout. We are accepting applications right now for the next session that's starting, and they can find out more about that and reach out to me over at writing-gym.com. And I love to hear from people, so you can also tweet me if you're on Twitter at Annalisa Parent, all one word. And if you'd like to pre-order the book, it is available for pre-order at storytellingforpantsers.com. And we're giving away a copy of the workbook for free for everyone who pre-orders the book. The official launch date of the book is September 6th. That happens to be my birthday. I was really excited that the publisher let me do that. They said early September. I said September 6th. They said yes. So over at storytellingforpantsers.com, they can pre-order and get a copy of the workbook for free before September 6th.
Oh, that is awesome. About Virgo, so it makes total sense then. It's that fiery earth side, practical but energetic. I love it.
There you go.
Oh, that is sweet. That is sweet. And so, and of course, they sign up and take this course online with you. And how does that work then?
Yeah, so we have people from all over the world in the Writing Gym VIP, and we're meeting every week online, and you get feedback on your manuscript. Of course, it's all based on the neuroscientific and pedagogical principles that I've shared with you today. And in 8 weeks, writers work toward completion of their novel. Many finish the novel in 8 weeks. Some of them work through it on a 12-week system. And then they can move on into the publishing mastermind, and we work toward publication at that point in writing query letters and meeting agents.
So, I mean, this is very doable. You have a story to tell, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you have a story to tell. It's all storytelling. And you might, well, I'm not that good, or I don't know. You're making it doable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, that's a really nice thing when you're working in tandem with the way that the brain is intended to function, is that confidence builds naturally because you've gotten quality, real feedback. It's not gratuitous. It's actually on what you're doing. So that's just one of the really awesome side benefits of the work that I do, is that writers grow in confidence and knowing what they're doing well.
Right. And there's nothing like getting good feedback, because I tell the story, you know, that you hit these plateaus and, you know, oh, do I move forward and everything. And to me, the most difficult choice I had the whole book manuscript done. It was edited, had the cover design, everything was done, had it, you know, registered with the Library of Congress, you name it, ISBN, it was all done. Mm-hmm. There was one more step, and that was to hit the send button on my laptop to the publisher printer, you know, to get that done. And it was just like, because once you do that, you no longer have it. And that was it. But, you know, and I tell people, you know, one of the works I read that helped me over that hurdle was Stephen Pressfield's work, The War of Art. And that concept, he calls it resistance, and how we fight ourselves all the time, you know. So even writer's block, I got writer's block. He goes, no, you just don't want to write, or you're afraid to write, or whatever, is get it down to. And so when I was able to move through his thinking there, and I went, yeah, this is what it is, because it's fear. You know, like, oh, how's this going to be received? People are going to laugh at me. They're going to ridicule me, or they're going to pan me, whatever. All the negatives come in. And then once it came out, I got all this great feedback from everybody going like, wow, what a great story. You know, like, you know, whoa, okay. So, no, I hear it when people are going like, I'm not sure, you know, like this, and say, yep, been there, done that. You know? And at some point, you just bite the bullet and move forward, you know, and get it done. Yeah, so awesome conversation. Sorry for all the technical snafus. I will do my best to clean up some of those, edit it out and whatever, and we'll make it a whole piece. But we'll get this back going for you. But congratulations on your work. Storytelling for Pantsers out in just over 4 or 5 weeks now, September 6th. So, okay, give us that website one more time.
storytellingforpantsers.com.
And if they want to sign up for your classes and so forth, workshops?
writing-gym.com. Don't forget the dash.
Don't forget the dash, yeah. And it's not a hyphen, it's a dash. We English teachers get into a little, okay, there's a difference between the two, that sort of thing.
Yeah, is it M dash or N dash?
All right. Okay, Annalisa, thank you so much, and we'll be talking more down the road. I'm looking forward to looking at your work, reading your work, and helping me through being a pantser. You know, it's like, oh my God, I got this chaos out there, and it's like, okay, chaos theory will all come together in time.
Yes, I call it the storytelling vortex. So.
Oh, I like that, storytelling vortex. I'm always in one of the whirlwinds going up there, you know. So great stuff here. So, all right, thank you again. I'm glad you're enjoying your day on Lake Champlain up there in Vermont, and congratulations once again. And we'll be back in contact. And so be safe and be good.
Thank you all for listening to our resident writing coach, Annalisa Parent, interviewed by author Jerry Fabyanic live on KYGT, Idaho Springs, Colorado, about her upcoming book, Storytelling for Pantsers. If you'd like to be among the first to get a copy of Storytelling for Pantsers, pre-orders are now open at www.storytellingforpantsers.com. Happy writing!
This has been the Writing Gym Podcast with Andy Brixey and Annalisa Parent. To join the Writing Gym, visit www.writing-gym.com.